Hey guys, tonight we're curling up inside a crooked old guest house in the ancient state of Lu. Outside, a breeze rattles the bamboo slats, the lantern light flickers low, and somewhere nearby, a rooster is already regretting tomorrow. But inside, you're lying on a creaky mat beside a young man snoring ever so lightly through his nose, his long hair tucked under a frayed head wrap, one foot peeking from under his straw blanket. This, allegedly, is Confucius. And if you believe the later texts, he's talking in his sleep again. What does he say? Something about virtue, or maybe it's about boiled millet. You lean closer. He murmurs, "The gentleman is not a vessel," then turns over and mumbles something else that sounds like "don't put turnips near the scrolls." You squint into the shadows, wondering how much of this would make it into the annals. Probably not the turnips, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see how far this sleepy caravan stretches down. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Breathe in slowly. The floor is dusty, the walls bowed from age, but the night is full of gentle cricket song. And this sleeping scholar, future sage of sages, doesn't seem to mind the splinters outside, in the half-lit alleys of Khufu. Oxen snort and clop past quietly. It's about 520 BCE. Most people are just trying to stay warm and keep their rice bowls full. Philosophy isn't exactly trending. Yet in this moment, curled beside a murmuring young bureaucrat who won't become famous for another few decades, you can already feel something odd stirring in the silence. He rolls over again. Ritual, benevolence, double quotes, then a soft snore. His blanket slips, revealing an ink-stained sleeve cuff. You pull it back over his shoulder. You're not sure why. It just feels respectful. You lie back and stare at the wobbly ceiling beams. You wonder how he got here, this strange idealistic man with big ideas and limited social tact. He was born into a low-ranking noble family. Technically a she-class somewhere between a scholar and a soldier, with not enough silver to be taken seriously by either. His dad died when he was 3. Some say he used to stack bricks and imitate rituals as a toddler. Others think that's just flattering legend. Historians still argue whether he was truly a prodigy, or just incredibly persistent. Either way, he spent his teens studying the rites, the classics, and whatever scraps of history he could borrow. No formal school, no dazzling mentor. Just a stubborn hunger for meaning and, possibly a fear of being average. And let's be honest, Confucius didn't have a lot of hobbies. He wasn't into drinking contests or bronze chariot racing. He didn't compose epic war ballads or dance in feathered hats. He liked rules. He liked harmony. He believed people could be taught to be better, which, in his time, was either charmingly naive or deeply annoying. You shift slightly on the mat. It creaks louder than you expected. Confucius snorts, then mutters. The nobleman speaks with weight, then silence again. Did he just insult you in his sleep? Hard to tell. His early followers would later write that even his nighttime mumblings were wise. He dreamt of the ancients, they'd say. Even asleep, the master studied righteousness. It's poetic. But maybe, just maybe, he also mumbled about laundry. or the chicken that kept stealing his ink brush. A candle gutters low in the corner. You can smell the old wood, the ink a hint of mildew. It's oddly comforting. You wonder what it must have felt like, being him, this tall, earnest man, wandering through corrupt courts and dusty archives, offering his advice to people who mostly ignored it. He wanted to serve. He believed the state could be ethical, and most dukes just wanted better grain taxes. Still, Confucius kept going, preaching restraint in an age of swordplay, recommending merit in an era of bloodlines. The sleep-talked dreams of a man with nothing but dusty shoes and the hope that humans could choose decency. There's a thump from the courtyard, probably a goat, possibly a ghost. You pull the blanket tighter and pretend it doesn't matter. Back beside you, Confucius murmurs again. You lean close. Harmony begins ... with yourself. Then silence. A mouse skitters across the far beam. You lie very still, listening to the slow breathing of the man who would someday define moral behavior for a third of the planet. But tonight, he's just a guy on a straw mat, drooling slightly into his sleeve, dreaming of metaphors. Outside, the stars wobble in the pond. Someone coughs 3 houses down, and in this small, soft moment, you realize that even the world's great thinkers once snored into the dark, half-formed thoughts drifting through their heads like paper lanterns over a sleepy village. Morning. Light leaks into the crooked guest house through warped paper windows. You blink awake, stretching on the woven mat as a rooster delivers a late, half-hearted crow. Across the room, Confucius is already up, quietly adjusting his belt and squinting at a faded scroll with the kind of grim determination usually reserved for tax collectors and puzzle makers. You shuffle to your feet and follow him out into the courtyard, where several chickens peck aimlessly near a crooked ink. The air smells like rice gruel and old sandals. Today, Confucius has somewhere to be. You trudge after him, your sandals slapping the cobblestones, toward a low brick hall where the local civil service exams are being held. The mood dread mixed with mildew, a bureaucratic fever dream. He doesn't look nervous though, he looks ... annoyed. Mostly because someone forgot to sweep the entrance. And a Confucian examination should never begin with disrespect for the floor. Historians still argue whether Confucius ever formally passed these state exams, or if he was simply recognized for his moral character. What we do know is that by his early 20s, he was holding a minor administrative job, possibly managing grain stores, or inspecting livestock, or just correcting other people's paperwork with passive-aggressive notes in perfect calligraphy. You sit on a stone bench while Confucius enters the hall. There are no desks, just long mats and bamboo slips, and the candidates are hunched over, writing furiously with brushes that shed bristles like molting sparrows. A proctor snores in the corner. Another one paces, muttering about ink shortages. One man has fainted dramatically over his answer scroll. You sip barley tea and pretend to be impressed. The test covers everything: the classics, mathematics, ritual protocol, and something called proper hat etiquette during funerals. You try reading over someone's shoulder and see this gem in a procession of elder statesmen. Where does the nephew of the minister's wife stand if the deceased was born in a metal year? You stop trying after that. Confucius, meanwhile, is already done with the essay section. He hands in his work with the serene look of someone who just explained how to fix society using 6 metaphors, 3 quotes from dead kings, and a parable about a goose who respects his elders. You follow him out into the courtyard, where he promptly steps in duck droppings and mutters, "Even the noble man must watch his step." He doesn't say it for your benefit, but you mentally file it away as a quote. Everything he says sounds vaguely quotable. The results aren't posted for days, so you wander the streets of Khufu with him while he waits. He visits booksellers, correcting their grammar. He buys sticky rice and gives half to a boy with torn shoes. He tells a small crowd of farmers that a society without virtue is like soup without salt. Then immediately apologizes to the salt seller for sounding elitist. It's slow, meandering, and faintly exhausting. Not a single moment feels historic, but every gesture has a kind of sleepy conviction. He's not chasing fame, he's just trying to be decent in a world where decency rarely gets tenure. Eventually, someone posts the exam results on a large wooden board. You stand there reading them upside down because Confucius refuses to jostle or elbow anyone, even politely. He waits. People part for him anyway. He passed, likely with distinction. Though Confucius merely nods and says, "More study is always needed." A lesser man would be celebrating with barley wine and dramatic haiku. Confucius goes home and copies out the rights of Joe until the ink smears. You start to notice something about him. He doesn't fidget, he doesn't rush. Even when eating, he chews every bite like it's a sentence he's editing. Later that evening, you find him squatting by a dry pond, reciting lines from old dynastic laws and occasionally swatting at flies. The ancients were not flawless, he says, but they knew how to sit quietly. You try sitting quietly. You last 3 minutes before sneezing. He smiles, barely dot in this slowness, this dusty rhythm of ritual and repetition. Something starts to make sense. He's not inventing anything new. He's reminding people of what they forgot, even if nobody asked him to. You remember the old legend that even as a child, he arranged bricks into ceremonial altars. Some say he refused to play war games with other boys, preferring to conduct imaginary ancestor veneration. That might be an exaggeration, but as you sit beside him now, with the wind rustling the reeds and the moon peeking over the wall, it seems entirely plausible. And then he says, "We must be like water." You blink. In what way, you ask? He looks over, a little amused. "Every way. Now go wash the teacups." So you do. Because even in sleep or silence or obscure government procedures, he's still kind of the boss. You spend the next few days walking through a maze of corridors with walls made of old wood and rules. The archive building leans slightly to one side, like it's tired of standing upright after centuries of bad posture and bureaucratic whispering. Inside, the air smells like dried bamboo, tea leaves, and faint despair. You follow Confucius as he glides silently down rows of ancient scrolls, trailing his fingers along labels written in an ink so faded it might as well be ghost handwriting. He stops occasionally, frowns, pulls a scroll halfway out, then changes his mind and mutters something about misaligned dynastic headings. You whisper, "What are we looking for?" He replies, "Accuracy," which here feels like a very tall order. A local librarian with eyebrows like wind-blown thatch appears from behind a curtain and nods at Confucius. Back again, she says, with a hint of something between respect and exhausted tolerance. Did the king finally ask for your advice? No, Confucius says simply. But perhaps the bamboo slips will. She sighs and disappears, leaving you alone with a man who treats silence like a second language and scrolls like living beings. This archive is supposed to house the full written history of the Lu state and its neighboring regions. But after years of insects, misfiling, and wars that treated libraries like kindling, it's more like a very dignified guessing game. You watch as Confucius tries to reconcile three versions of the same event, one of which insists that Duke Wan died of natural causes, another that he was poisoned, and the third that he fell into a well while rehearsing a ritual dance. Historians still argue whether Confucius genuinely believed history could teach people morality, or if he just couldn't let go of the idea that even flawed stories could point toward better behavior. He opens a scroll and reads aloud. The noble person aligns his conduct with the seasons, then pauses and asks, "What do you think it means?" You shrug. "Don't plant cucumbers in the snow." He raises an eyebrow, not entirely displeased, but behind the discipline, the method. The near ritualistic way he inspects records and corrects punctuation with a gentle brush tap. There's something else, a quiet desperation, like he's trying to hold the whole past together before it collapses into memory foam. You ask him about that, well, sort of. You say, "Why do you care if some duke 20 years ago had a concubine named Peach Blossom or Magnolia?" He says, "Because when names blur, actions blur. And when actions blur, so does justice." You make a mental note never to name anything vaguely floral. There's a fringe theory you once overheard in a night market, possibly from a seller of candied walnuts, that Confucius didn't trust people to remember anything without writing it down. That he once even tried to catalog different styles of ceremonial bowing, depending on wind speed. You're not sure it's true, but after watching him copy a single proverb 7 times just to compare stroke width, you believe anything is possible. Later, that afternoon, you both sit on a cracked bench while he fans the drying ink on a new commentary he's writing about an older commentary, on a fragment of an original ritual manual that may or may not have been invented by a drunken scribe. It's like watching a man build a tower out of teacups and breath. You hear the librarian rustling behind you. She brings tea, bitter, grassy, served in a cracked bowl that probably predates Confucius himself. She sits beside you with a heavy sigh and says, "You know, some of these slips were copied by teenagers, apprentices with shaky hands. We've been trusting their ink for centuries." Confucius nods, sipping the tea. Still, even imperfect copies carry echoes. You lie back against the wall and listen to the room's quiet breathing. Outside, the sun droops low over tiled roofs, casting long shadows through the lattice. Inside, the scrolls rustle gently in their cubbies, like they're sighing too. Confucius begins another slow transcription, and you realize he's not just chasing knowledge, he's restoring order, one character at a time. It's dull, painstaking, obsessive, and somehow quietly beautiful. Somewhere between the 15th and 16th scroll, you start to doze. You dream that the bamboo slips are whispering, and that the librarian is chasing a duck wearing official robes. Confucius floats by, repeating, "File the virtue before the vice." You wake to the sound of his brush tapping the inkwell. Another line copied, another piece of the past preserved, and not a single person applauded. You're sitting on a rickety wooden stool, watching Confucius try to negotiate with a goat. The goat is winning. It's got its teeth clamped around a frayed edge of his robe and is refusing to let go, despite all philosophical appeals to reason. Even animals, he says patiently, respond to virtue. The goat responds by yanking harder. You sigh, helping him untangle the stubborn beast before it eats half a sleeve and, possibly, the man's dignity. He thanks you without looking up, then heads back toward a tiny courtyard filled with scrolls, buckets, and the faint smell of pickled radish. This is Confucius in his 20s. Trying out every job that society will allow a well-read, underfunded man to do. It's a strange patchwork of roles: part-time clerk, seasonal accountant, cowherd, occasional musician, and full-time philosopher in training. You suspect he might have even cleaned latrines at some point, though he'd probably describe it as reordering the waste hierarchy for civil harmony. He's a man searching for a way into the system, into respectability, into a place where ideas matter. But for now, he mostly manages rice deliveries and practices ritual bowing in the mirror. One of his more awkward gigs was teaching the guqian, a zither-like instrument that sounds like a sigh and a drizzle had a baby. He never brags about his playing, but you catch him plucking quietly some evenings, shaping melodies that drift like incense through the window slats. Historians still argue whether Confucius genuinely enjoyed music or simply viewed it as a vessel for moral clarity. Either way, his students would later claim that music was one of the 4 pillars of noble behavior, right alongside ritual, propriety, and not interrupting people at funerals. You follow him through the side streets of Khufu, where he offers unsolicited ethical advice to fishmongers, then helps a vendor rearrange his cabbages into more aesthetically harmonious rows. You suspect he can't turn it off, the constant measuring of the world against an ideal that doesn't exist yet. Maybe never did. He pauses at a stone bench under a sagging awning. There's a light rain, and he opens a woven fan, not to cool himself, but, somehow, out of ritual habit. You sit beside him. I once took inventory of 400 oxen, he says flatly. You nod, waiting. They were less troublesome than dukes. He says it like a joke. You laugh like it's one. He doesn't smile. His jobs pay just enough to afford porridge, ink, and the occasional new sash when the old one gets frayed past the point of dignity. But you can tell none of it satisfies him. Every assignment is just a platform for him to observe what's broken in the state, who bribes who's forgotten the old rituals, who stumbles through ceremonies without understanding the point. There's a fringe theory that this time in his life shaped his obsession with order, not because he was always idealistic, but because he saw so much sloppiness up close. Even the way clerks bowed was inconsistent. He once got mildly furious about a fellow tax collector who used the wrong brushstroke for the word grain. You wouldn't think brushstroke density could spark moral outrage. And yet, here we are. That evening, you're helping him sweep his tiny room when he suddenly sits down and begins sketching ideas on scrapped parchment. No titles, no dates, just phrases. Rectify the names. A man without virtue is like a cart without a wheel. Do not chase vomit, runs faster. You ask him who he's writing this for. He says, anyone who doesn't want to live. Foolishly, later, you lie on the mat across from him again. The goat has been successfully reholed. The scrolls are stacked neatly in the corner. He's asleep, one arm flung over his face. Then, softly, to lead others, first lead yourself. It's not quite a snore, not quite a proverb. You can't tell if he's dreaming of better governments or just remembering which student borrowed his only inkstone. But in that quiet, between the breathing and the rain, you get it. He's building something slowly, thanklessly, job by job, scroll by scroll, complaint by complaint. Like stacking pebbles into a path no one else sees yet. And maybe, just maybe, the world will walk it someday. You're sitting cross-legged on a stone floor, trying not to fall asleep while Confucius delivers a passionate speech to absolutely no one, not a single student in sight, not even a curious chicken. Just you, a cracked gourd of lukewarm tea, and the world's most determined monologue on virtue. To govern is to correct, he says, gesturing to the air like it owes him rent. If you set an example, others will follow. If you misuse names, chaos begins. You nod solemnly, even though you're mostly thinking about noodles. This isn't unusual. Sometimes his students just don't show up. Some oversleep. Some forget. One of them may have joined a traveling acrobat troupe. Confucius doesn't seem bothered. Or rather, he does, but he's transcended the need to complain. Instead, he delivers lectures to the empty courtyard with the same fire he'd bring to a royal audience. Historians still argue whether these lonely lectures were common practice or legendary embellishments added later to enhance his mystique. But the image of a lone sage preaching to the breeze is just too delicious to resist. You shift slightly. The floor's cold. There's a breeze sneaking in under the gate, lifting the hem of his robe as he quotes from ancient kings and imagines a better society, one where people respect their parents, bow at the correct angle, and never cut in. Line at the millet stand. There's a distant sneeze from a neighbor's window. Confucius doesn't pause. He speaks of the junzi, the gentleman, the noble person, who behaves with propriety, even when unobserved. To be good when watched is no feat, he says. To be good when alone, that is character. You glance around. Yup, still just you and a moth circling the lantern. So far, you're both getting a masterclass. You wonder, not for the first time, why he bothers. These speeches, these teachings, their seeds flung into the wind. Half of them will land in muddy ditches. Some will be trampled by oxen. And yet, he keeps sowing. You know why, though. Because this is his ritual, his rhythm. It's not for the crowd, it's for the craft. And if the audience never arrives, well, the courtyard listens. When he finishes, he bows to no one in particular. Then he picks up a brush and begins writing what he just said, as if preparing for a future where someone, somewhere, might care. You stretch out on the floor and stare at the cracked ceiling tiles. A spider is making morally dubious decisions about where to build its web. You respect that Confucius breaks the silence. The ancients never complained about their students. You raise an eyebrow. Maybe their students showed up. He doesn't smile, but the corner of his mouth does. Something that might one day be mistaken for amusement. You help him collect the scrolls. The ink is still drying. He's written today's thoughts on virtue in large, clear characters. You recognize one phrase: lead with dignity, not fear. Underneath, a smaller line: if the students forget, teach the wind. It's not in the Analects, but maybe it should be. The next morning, the students show up late, disheveled. One has a grasshopper in his sleeve. Another is missing his shoes. Confucius doesn't scold them. He simply resumes the lecture exactly where he left off. You, of course, already know the entire segment. You mouth it silently along with him like it's your favorite lullaby. Later that week, you pass a courtyard where another teacher, portly, red-faced, and wildly impatient, is berating his class. He shouts, he sweats. He threatens them with exam failure and familial shame. Confucius, passing by, says nothing, but he does adjust his belt slightly tighter and walks a little taller. There's a quiet pride in what he's building, not a school. Exactly, more like a blueprint for being human. That night, you find him practicing calligraphy by candlelight. He's rewriting the same line again and again. Rectify the heart before the state. Won't your students read it tomorrow? You ask. They might, he says. But they'll forget. I must remember, you nod. Somewhere, a cricket chirps. You listen to the gentle rasp of brush on paper, and it sounds like thought itself, soft and persistent. And as the lantern flickers, you realize something odd. You didn't notice when you stopped needing an audience either. It begins as so many great stories do. With a spoon, you're in the kitchen of a mid-sized official's home where Confucius is serving as a consultant in what can only be described as a glorified etiquette advisory role. The kitchen is sweltering. There's turnip soup boiling on the stove, steam clinging to the rafters, and a low-ranking cook trying very hard not to cry over a misplaced ritual spoon. You're seated near the window, fanning yourself with a napkin, and wondering how you ended up at the intersection of metaphysics and lunch prep. The spoon, specifically the left-hand ceremonial serving ladle, has gone missing just before the nobleman's minor ancestor offering ceremony. Cue panic. Without the correct spoon, the dish can't be served with the expected symmetry. The family standing in the community at risk. The ancestors, potentially insulted. The cook's career, dangling by a stringy noodle. Confucius steps in with the same composure he brings to palace disputes. He surveys the scene, takes one long breath, and says, "A ritual is not the vessel, but the intention." The cook blinks. The soup may be ladled with a cup, so long as the heart is steady. You raise an eyebrow. So, that's your advice. Just use a cup. He nods. Gently, and ladle it slowly, as if it were sacred. Historians still argue whether this small event actually inspired a passage in the Analects that reads, "Ritual is not rigidity. Propriety without sincerity is mere form." Some think the kitchen story was a metaphor added later. Others insist it was just a really awkward Tuesday. What's more fascinating is how that tiny monsop spoon substitution becomes a core lesson. The nobleman, of course, goes through with the ceremony using a tea bowl instead. No spirits revolt. Ominous clouds. Just some very polite nodding from the ancestral tablets and a slightly overloaded turnip broth. But the aftermath is where things get weird. Confucius jots down a few lines about substance over form, and suddenly every nearby scholar is debating the true meaning of sincerity. For weeks, You hear arguments in tea shops. Does intention really override ritual? Or does breaking protocol unravel the whole social tapestry? One young student, emboldened by this idea, stops wearing his formal sash to class. Confucius gently reminds him that some threads still matter. You start to see how these moments, quirky, mundane, almost laughably, end up woven into something deeper. Not because of what they were, but because of how Confucius turned them into reflection. It's as if every incident is a parable waiting to happen. A missing spoon becomes an ethical dilemma. A crooked hat, a comment on self-respect, a spilled ink blot, an entire lecture on the impermanence of reputation. Later that week, he catches a magistrate sneaking away from a prayer ceremony early. Rather than shame him directly, Confucius says within earshot, the nobleman finishes what he begins, even when no one watches. The magistrate turns purple. You pretend to examine a wall scroll and try not to laugh. At night, Confucius sometimes murmurs bits of those earlier lessons in his sleep. You hear him once, clear as day or night, really say, if one forgets the reason for the rule rules nothing. You lie there wondering if he dreams in commentary, if his thoughts loop like a ritual dance with no endpoint. Or maybe he just relives kitchen mishaps like moral puzzles. That same week, he's invited to speak to a group of minor officials in training. The theme, what makes a ritual true? He brings no scrolls, no notes, just walks slowly to the front, pauses, and says, did you bow this morning to your elders with your head or your heart? Silence. Then, slowly, one by one, they start to understand what he's getting at. You watch from the corner. It's not that his teachings are groundbreaking. They're reminders he's not giving people new laws. He's asking them to notice what they're doing and why. The problem is, sometimes people don't want to notice. One of the nobles accuses him of undermining tradition. If we start interpreting rites too loosely, the man says, we'll end up honoring ancestors with chopsticks. Confucius bows. And yet, perhaps better with chopsticks and gratitude than with spoons and scorn. You think about that lost ladle, how the cook still makes jokes about it, calls it the sacred scoop now. How it's probably somewhere under a cabinet, covered in dust. Unaware it launched a minor philosophical movement. And you wonder how many tiny things Confucius has turned into doctrine over the years. A glance, a pause, a polite refusal to accept moldy rice. He doesn't force people to follow him. He just keeps living his message until they either start listening or feel guilty for not listening. And maybe, in the end, that's why he works. You fall asleep that night to the distant clatter of bowls in the kitchen and Confucius, half asleep, murmuring, ladle with care. Always ladle with care. It's mid-morning, and you're sitting beside Confucius under a slowly crumbling pavilion, watching him write a letter with all the enthusiasm of a man dictating advice into a void. His ink brush pauses mid-stroke, then continues with a flourish. So controlled it's almost resentful. The letter is addressed to yet another local duke. You've lost count of how many he's written. Each one a calm, meticulously worded plea for reforms in governance, moral clarity, education, and this is his favorite: better ritual conduct in court. None of these dukes reply. Some scholars today believe that Confucius spent more time writing to people who ignored him than to those who ever listened. There's even a fringe theory that he crafted these letters not to be read but to be preserved, as if he knew that centuries later they'd become artifacts, echoes of his patient hopefulness. He folds the scroll, ties it with a frayed silk ribbon, and hands it to a courier who's been half-napping in the shade of a plum tree. The courier accepts it with the weary nod of someone who knows the recipient won't read past the first proverb. You ask him why he bothers. Confucius says, "The message matters even when unheard," which is noble, sure, but also mildly exhausting. You walk with him through the marketplace afterward, the sounds of haggling and livestock clashing awkwardly with his internal monologue about state ethics. He looks at the cobbler and notes how the man focuses on the smallest stitching detail. Even shoes require attention, and yet we appoint ministers with less. You glance around. Nobody else is listening. Just you, and a pig chewing on a sandal. Back home, he begins drafting another letter. This one to a nobleman he met only once, years ago, during a ceremonial banquet where the soup was too salty and the courtiers too loud. Still, Confucius writes as though they've been locked in deep philosophical dialogue for years. He may remember me, he says, or he may remember the words I use to describe patience. You want to ask him if he ever considers quitting, giving up the letter-writing campaign, tossing his inkstone into the river and becoming a melon farmer. But the thought seems almost disrespectful. Historians still argue whether Confucius truly expected his reforms to be adopted or if he merely used the exercise to shape and clarify his own thinking. Some say the letters were more for his students than the dukes, examples of how to speak with dignity, even to power that doesn't care. He once told a student, "A crooked tree may still cast a straight shadow if the sun is placed just right." You try to decode that one for 3 days. You end up concluding it might be about hope, or optics, or landscaping. Maybe all three. You spend one evening helping him prepare a batch of letters, folding them with thin rice paper, sealing them with wax that smells faintly of sesame. He doesn't rush. He rewrites each scroll until the flow feels honest and clean, even if the Duke won't read past a steamed ruler of harmonious intent. The rest must be perfect. He sends one to a minister known for extravagance, suggesting with tact that when the wine flows more freely than justice, the state must ask which is served more often. The reply, silence. Though a week later, the minister does sponsor a temple renovation. Coincidence? Who knows? You wonder aloud, what if your words do nothing? Confucius, sipping tea from a cup chipped at the rim, says, "Then I will know I still said them." That night, you find him outside beneath a dim moon, practicing a speech aloud to no one. It's meant for a prince who once invited him to court and then promptly forgot. The speech is careful, lyrical. It praises balance, criticizes greed and metaphor, and offers guidance on ministerial conduct using the extended allegory of a carp who refuses to swim upstream without good reason. You blink. Is the carp a metaphor for you? He looks over. The carp is a metaphor for anyone ignored by their own stream. You lie on your back, staring at the stars. Crickets creak their rhythmic song, like 1,000 tiny brushstrokes in the dark. And somewhere far off, a messenger carries another sealed scroll through winding roads, bound for a noble house where it will sit unopened on a lacquered desk until it's eventually used to level a wobbly table. Still it was written. Still it meant something. And in that, Confucius rests easy. You're napping against the warm side of a stone wall when the plum tree beside you starts vibrating with the force of an extremely polite philosophical argument. You peek one eye open and spot Confucius, standing very straight, calmly addressing a rival philosopher who looks like he spent the morning shouting at goats. The rival's name is Mo, or perhaps Zheng, or possibly something else entirely. Nobody's written this down properly. What matters is that he's loud, dramatic, and absolutely convinced that Confucius is missing the point of everything. Rituals are empty. The rival bellows. You can't eat respect. You can't clothe yourself in ceremony. What matters is universal love. Confucius, unshaken, gently smooths a wrinkle in his sleeve. Love without structure becomes chaos, he says. Compassion without ritual is like soup without a bowl. It's not exactly a mic drop. But the rival philosopher visibly twitches. They go back and forth beneath the tree, their voices rising like a slow kettle. You try to stay awake, mostly because this is the most excitement you've seen since the ceremonial spoon incident. The debate drifts from politics to poetry, from ethics to the precise etiquette for bowing at weddings where one party is slightly late. Confucius remains calm. Every statement is measured, each word trimmed and balanced, like an artfully manicured bonsai. His opponent waves his arms, repeats himself, and invents hypothetical societies filled with farmers who spontaneously achieve justice without ever learning to kneel properly. Historians still argue whether this debate actually occurred or if it was invented later by one of Confucius's more theatrical students. Some versions say it ended with a shared pot of tea. Others claim the rival stormed off and tripped over a dog. You sit nearby and take notes, not because you plan to publish them, but because even Confucius's casual remarks feel strangely weighty. He says things like, "A straight path may lead through a crooked forest." And you nod, even though you're 90% sure it's just about getting home before sunset. There's a pause in the argument. Confucius looks at the plum tree and says, "See how it blooms without fuss. It knows its time." The rival rolls his eyes. It also can't talk. Confucius replies, "Exactly." That's when the man walks off in a huff, possibly to go yell at clouds or compose an essay titled "Why Plum Trees Are Smug." Confucius simply sits down, dusts off his robe, and begins peeling a small turnip with monk-like precision. You ask if he won. He shrugs. Words are not arrows. They must land gently. You're not sure if that's a victory quote or just lunchtime wisdom, but either way, the turnip is shared later. You find the students huddled under a canopy, arguing over the same points. One says the rival was right. Another insists Confucius delivered a quiet triumph. A third asks if it's morally acceptable to eat 2 rice cakes during a debate, if the second one is for emphasis. Confucius walks by and says, "Argue with curiosity, not hunger." Then adds, "But eat first, if you must." That evening, while walking home, he tells you the rival wasn't wrong, just impatient. Even good ideas can be spoiled if they shout too loud, he says. You pass a woman sweeping her doorstep. Confucius nods to her. She brings order to her space. That is philosophy too. The wind picks up. plum petals drift around you. You try catching one, miss, and blame the metaphor. You ask him, "Do you ever get tired of debates?" Only when they forget to listen. That night, he sleeps soundly, hands folded over his chest like he's practicing for a particularly respectful dream. At one point, he murmurs, "Let the tree bloom, even if no one claps." You drift off to the soft rustling of leaves overhead, and the faint memory of a day where ideas collided under a plum tree, not in anger, but in search of shape. You're ankle deep in mud. Again, that time, you're following Confucius through a rice paddy because one of his former students, now a mid-level official with the kind of job title that sounds both powerful and meaningless, has invited him to offer moral observations on agricultural planning, which, as it turns out, involves a lot more actual rice than you anticipated. Confucius doesn't complain. He steps carefully, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the field as though the behavior of stalks can reveal something about the human soul. The farmer guiding you scratches his head. You're looking for corruption in the mud. Confucius replies, "Disorder begins at the roots," which makes the farmer nod as if he understands. You're not so sure he does. You definitely don't, but it sounds impressive. You walk the length of the irrigation system, a system which, according to the farmer, mostly works, except when it doesn't, which is frequently. Confucius studies it with the same intensity. He brings to palace rituals or ancient scrolls. He crouches beside a sluice gate, runs his fingers along the wood, and says softly, "Water, when guided, nourishes. When uncontained, it destroys." You've heard this metaphor before, twice. Once about education, once about laughter during funerals. Historians still argue whether Confucius's time spent consulting on irrigation was purely symbolic, or if he genuinely contributed technical ideas. There's even an obscure text suggesting he once redesigned a canal layout using logic borrowed from musical harmonies. That could be a myth, or a joke, or both. Back at the village hall, the student turned greets Confucius with an elaborate bow and slightly less elaborate tea. He's clearly nervous, trying to impress his old teacher with improved posture, well-rehearsed political opinions, and a new mustache that looks glued on in haste. They sit, the official talks about harvest quotas. Confucius listens, then quietly he asks, "How many farmers attended the seasonal rites this year?" The man blinks. "We focused more on distribution efficiency." Confucius gently sips his tea. Efficiency is not excellence. And just like that, the mustache almost falls off. Later, walking through the market, he explains it to you. When we forget ceremony, we forget gratitude. When we forget gratitude, greed replaces it. You counter, but people can't eat gratitude. He stops beside a row of sun-dried fish, turns to you and says, "No, but without it, people forget who catches the fish, and who taught them how." You buy a dried pear and ponder that while chewing. It's not untrue. But sometimes it feels like he's fighting a war with proverbs, while everyone else is armed with ledgers. That night, you're invited to a small feast with village leaders. Confucius is the guest of honor, but the seating chart is a disaster. Elders are placed near the stove. A junior scribe is sitting at the head table. Someone poured the rice wine before the first toast. It's chaos, politely disguised as celebration. You expect Confucius to protest. Instead, he quietly helps an old woman to a better seat, corrects a toast mid-sentence by adding a poetic flourish, and eats his sticky rice with impeccable grace. You ask him later why he didn't say anything. "I did," he says. Without speaking, you groan. You know that's frustrating, right? He smiles faintly, only because it works. The next morning, a new seating chart is posted in the village hall. It mirrors the arrangement Confucius adjusted during the feast. No announcements, no fanfare. Just a quiet shift toward order. A child walks by and greets him with a bow. Confucius bows in return, just slightly lower. You notice that so does the child. As you pack up to leave the village, Confucius walks once more to the rice fields. He stands in silence for a while, watching a line of ducks patrol the edge of a canal. Then he turns to you and says, "Harmony does not shout." You nod because somehow, even the ducks seem to agree. You're trudging behind Confucius through the gates of yet another city-state. Your sandals flapping tiredly against cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of imperial ambivalence. The local guard waves you both in with the enthusiasm of a man who's seen exactly one too many philosophers this week. You ask, "Do they know you here?" Confucius says, "Not yet." Inside, the streets are busy with preparations for something being strung, robes being brushed, arguments being whispered under breath. A minor duke is hosting a seasonal festival, and every official from here to the northern ridge has shown up to be seen, praised, and possibly flattered into a new tax loophole. Naturally, Confucius has not been invited. That doesn't stop him from strolling directly to the temple square, where he politely observes a group of attendants rehearsing the opening rites. Their bows are rushed, their spacing uneven, and the lead official mispronounces a key invocation 3 times before giving up and pretending he didn't. You glance at Confucius. His eyelid twitches slightly, the closest thing he ever shows to full-body outrage. Still, he waits. The chief ritual planner, a man whose forehead shines with equal parts sweat and misplaced authority, spots Confucius lingering on the temple steps. His expression sours, like curdled tofu. "You're not listed on the guest scroll," the man says, as though this might send Confucius into a tailspin of shame. "I am a guest of the rites themselves." Confucius replies, so calmly it echoes. Historians still argue whether this moment was real or just a clever insertion by later disciples who couldn't resist poetic justice. Either way, it becomes the stuff of legend. Eventually, the ritual begins. Drums beat, bells chime, incense curls into the air in lazy, indifferent spirals. The crowd murmurs. You count no fewer than 12 errors within the first minute. An elder seated too far from center, an offering table set on the wrong axis, a ritual chant overlapping with a goat bleating. Confucius watches silently, then turns to you and says, "When ceremony becomes performance, meaning leaks out like cracked lacquer." You nod, not entirely sure what lacquer is, but certain it's leaking. Afterward, the crowd disperses into the wine and flattery portion of the evening. You trail Confucius through a garden full of peonies and uncomfortable conversations. Several lower-ranking scholars nod in his direction, but none are brave enough to approach. You suspect they've read his writings and are afraid he'll quiz them at the edge of the gathering. A younger official finally engages him in conversation. He starts confidently, quoting Confucius back at himself badly. Confucius smiles. Not warmly. The words are right, he says. But your tone trips them. The young man flushes red, excuses himself, and disappears behind a pavilion. You suspect he will later tell the story, as if he bested the master in spirited debate. He did not. You sit under a lantern while Confucius sketches something in the dirt with a twig. It's a map of the ceremonial layout but corrected. If they moved the incense burner to paces left, he murmurs, the wind wouldn't scatter the prayers. You point out that most people didn't seem to mind. He replies, that is the problem. You leave the gathering before midnight, weaving through sleeping dogs and scattered flower petals. Back at the guest house, Confucius sits by the window, brushing ash from his sleeves. You ask him why he didn't say anything during the ritual. Why he let the mistakes pass, he sighs. Sometimes, the moment for correction must wait for its echo. Later that week, you hear whispers that the ritual master has been reassigned to warehouse inventory. A new scroll appears on the temple. While a corrected version of the rites, suspiciously close to Confucius's dirt diagram. No one credits him, of course. You mention this, he shrugs. The ritual is the teacher. I am only the reminder. That night, as he dozes by the window, he murmurs something half-formed. The gods do not need incense. But people do. And you realize something strange. He's not trying to impress heaven. He's trying to reteach earth. You're in the back of a narrow, lantern-lit lecture hall, surrounded by a handful of students scribbling notes on bamboo. Slips with the focus of people trying very hard not to be noticed, nodding off. One is chewing his writing brush. Another appears to be composing a haiku about lunch at the front. Confucius is diagramming the structure of moral governance using pebbles, rice grains, and the strategic placement of a tea kettle. He is dead serious about it. The tea kettle represents the ruler, the grains, the people. The pebbles are something about balance and perhaps irrigation. You're not entirely sure anymore, but the students are nodding, mostly in fear. This isn't a standard school. It's more like a pop-up academy that relocates every time Confucius wears out his welcome in a particular city. Students join for a day, a month, sometimes years. There's no tuition, but Confucius insists on punctuality, silence during lectures, and respectful bowing even to ducks. You learn later that this early prototype of Confucian education was punching in its way, revolutionary. Until then, education was mostly the privilege of aristocrats. But Confucius opened the door quietly, steadily to anyone with curiosity and stamina. Historians still argue whether he truly said, in education, there should be no class distinctions, or whether one of his more idealistic disciples polished it up. Either way, he taught butchers, farmers, and ex-stable boys right alongside noble sons. Everyone copied the same texts. Everyone got the same withering look when they fidgeted too much during poetry recitations. One afternoon, you sit in on a writing lesson. A student asks, "What is the purpose of learning if I don't plan to govern?" Confucius pauses, then writes a character in the dirt. Ren, often translated as humaneness or benevolence. To understand others, he says. Even when we have no power over them, you glance around the circle. No one moves. It's the kind of moment where even insects hesitate. But then, as always, reality intrudes. There's a rustling at the back. A low-ranking envoy enters the hall, bowing far too shallow, and announces that the local lord has issued new edicts. Taxes are rising, land boundaries are shifting, and the village school is to be converted into a storage barn. The students groan. One mutters something that probably isn't printable in any translation. Confucius stands, adjusts his belt, and replies, "Then we will learn outside," which is how you end up in a field, surrounded by buzzing cicadas and overly curious goats, listening to a lesson on filial piety as Confucius uses a stick-to diagram. Proper burial rites in the mud. A goat eats part of the diagram. Nobody minds. You realize then that the true classroom isn't the building, it's wherever he happens to stand, and the blackboard, whatever's nearby. Dirt, bark, water, or breath. You're sitting beside a younger student later, one who's been struggling with writing the character for virtue. You help him trace it in the dust. He squints. Is this really going to help me in life? You say, probably not right away. Then, after a pause, but maybe when you least expect it. That night, you watch Confucius compiling students' writings by lamplight. He reads them without mockery, even the sloppy ones, even the essays that confuse morality with fishing metaphors. He corrects them gently, then sets them aside as if they're sacred, which, in his mind, they probably are. He hums as he works. Something slow and tonal, a teaching rhythm. Maybe it's a lullaby. Maybe it's just the sound of someone who believes every scrap of knowledge deserves care, even if no one else notices. You lie on the floor, listening to the brush move across bamboo. He says softly, more to himself than to you, education is not for answers. It's for better questions. And in that flickering silence, you realize that no matter how small this classroom is, no matter how ignored or laughed at it may be by men in gold-trimmed robes, it is a revolution, one made of patience, repetition, awkward ink stains, and a goat named Junzi, who still tries to eat the textbooks. You're wandering through a crowded market, when you suddenly realize Confucius is missing. You find him standing quietly near a stall, selling strange herbs and oddly shaped gourds. Engaged in conversation with the vendor, a wiry old woman with a knowing smile and a penchant for mysterious remedies. The topic: the art of calming the mind. It's not what you expected. You expected debates on justice, or lectures about filial piety, or at least a fresh complaint about corrupt officials. Instead, Confucius is listening intently as the woman describes a tea made from crushed lotus leaves that supposedly helps one sleep with fewer dreams. He nods thoughtfully. A clear mind is the foundation of virtue, he says softly. The woman beams, clearly pleased to have a philosopher in her corner. You watch them talk as the market bustles around you, the shouts of vendors, the scent of spices, the occasional squawk of a chicken. Historians still argue whether Confucius had any genuine interest in herbal medicine, or if these market visits were merely tactical, a way to observe everyday life and understand common people better. But there's something intimate about this moment. The merging of the practical and the philosophical. The idea that moral clarity might require physical calm, and that wisdom isn't just in scrolls, but in the mundane, in the daily rituals of breathing and resting. Later, Confucius invites you to try the tea. It's bitter but soothing. You sip slowly, feeling the tension in your shoulders ease. He tells you that sleep was often when he worked best, his dreams sometimes spilling out as whispered teachings in the dark. The mind unbound by daylight sees truths hidden in shadows, he says. You ask if he believes dreams can teach. He smiles faintly. Sometimes, what one mumbles in sleep is closer to the heart than waking words. That night, you lie awake, hearing his soft murmurs from the next room. You catch fragments, balance, harmony, the way of water. It's as if his subconscious continues the lecture. You try to decipher whether he's wrestling with personal doubts, or simply reciting lessons. Meanwhile, in the market, the herb vendor closes her stall, humming a tune that you recognize as one of Confucius's favorite melodies. You wonder how many philosophers might have missed this simple wisdom, that the path to virtue is sometimes lined with lotus leaves and a well-steeped cup. You drift into sleep yourself, the bitter tea lingering on your tongue, and the quiet promise that sometimes the loudest lessons come in the softest whispers. You wake early to the soft clatter of wooden sandals. On stone, the scent of dew-heavy earth mingling with distant incense smoke. Confucius is already awake, seated by a small fire, arranging sticks with the precision of a master strategist planning a war he hopes never to fight. Today, you're going to witness what the students call Confucius's long walks, meandering journeys through the countryside, where lessons arrive, not through speeches, but through silence, observation, and the occasional cryptic comment. As you follow him along a winding path, he pauses by a crooked tree. Notice this, he says, how the tree bends, but does not break. You nod, expecting a metaphor about resilience. Instead, he adds, it survives because it knows when to yield. You remember the earlier talk about carp swimming upstream and realize the message is consistent. Strength tempered by flexibility, you walk further, passing farmers tending to their fields with rhythmic, practiced movements. Confucius watches their hands, their gazes, their shared nods. The farmer's toil is the root of society's fruit, he murmurs. At a small stream, he crouches and dips his hands into the cool water. He looks up at you with a quiet intensity and says, a ruler who cannot govern himself is like water, trapped in mud, stagnant and foul. The walk continues in silence for a time. You notice how the sounds of nature, the chirp of cicadas, the rustle of bamboo, seem to mingle with his unspoken teachings. Historians still argue whether these walks were deliberate teaching moments or simply contemplative escapes for a man wearied by politics and pedantry. Perhaps both. On the path home, you encounter a group of children chasing butterflies. Confucius stops and smiles, a rare, unguarded moment. He tells you, even the smallest life participates in the order of the universe. You watch as one child catches a butterfly and carefully lets it go. Respect, Confucius says softly, is not just for people. Back at the pavilion, he picks up a brush and writes a single character on a scroll. Li, often translated as ritual or propriety. You see, he explains, Li is not just ceremony. It is the thread that weaves society together, binding heart to action. You lean back, feeling the weight of that simple idea. Later that evening, as he rests by the fire, he murmurs in his sleep, bend without breaking, hold without clenching. You realize that even in rest, his Mind is walking these paths, seeking harmony between strength and softness, order and freedom. You close your eyes, imagining the crooked tree, the flowing stream, the fluttering butterfly, all part of the same quiet lesson, whispered softly through time. You find yourself beside Confucius once more, this time in a bustling town square where an unexpected event is unfolding, a public dispute between two merchants over a missing shipment of silk. The crowd gathers, murmuring, while the merchants trade accusations like swords in a slow duel. Confucius approaches with his usual calm, the sort of quiet presence that somehow slows even the noisiest market chatter. One merchant accuses the other of deceit, the other insists it's a clerical error. Tempers flare, but the crowd waits expectantly, as if the sage's words will summon truth from the chaos. He listens first, letting each man speak fully without interruption. Then he asks a simple question: what is the root of your disagreement? Neither man can answer immediately. The tension hangs heavy, like humidity before a storm. Finally, Confucius suggests, if the silk is lost, who benefits from its absence? The merchants glance at each other, and then down at their hands, realizing the dispute isn't just about silk, but trust. He continues, a community thrives when its people act with integrity, even when no one watches. Historians still debate whether Confucius actually arbitrated such public disputes, or if this story serves as an allegory for his teachings on justice and social harmony. Either way, the lesson resonates. The merchants agree to mediation rather than fight, and the crowd disperses with a sense of relief. Later, Confucius reflects with you on the importance of mutual respect and fairness in daily life. Justice is not only in grand laws, he says, but in the way we treat those beside us. You think about how this principle threads through everything he teaches, from ritual to governance to simple kindness. As dusk settles, you both walk past lantern-lit stalls where children play and elders share stories. The world feels fragile, but full of potential, like a scroll just beginning to unfold. Confucius murmurs, almost to himself. Harmony begins with understanding, grows with patience, and blooms through kindness. You smile, feeling the weight of these words settle softly over the day's end. You're sitting quietly with Confucius beneath a canopy of stars. The night air cool and still, except for the faint rustle of leaves. The day's chatter has faded, replaced by the gentle hum of crickets and the distant murmur of a river winding its way through the valley. Tonight feels different. The weight of years, the endless teaching, the unanswered letters all seem to gather here, in this soft silence. Confucius looks up at the sky, tracing constellations with a finger as if mapping out unseen connections. The cosmos moves in cycles, he says softly, and so must we. You nod, feeling the vastness of time and space wrap around you both like a familiar robe. He begins to speak, not of politics or rituals, but of simple truths of balance, humility, and the quiet strength found in kindness. His voice is low, steady, a lullaby woven from centuries of wisdom and the gentle cadence of lived experience. Historians still debate what Confucius truly dreamed of in his final years, whether it was the perfect society or merely peace for his own restless mind. But listening to him now, you feel a deep sense of calm, as if his very breath carries the promise of harmony. He whispers, In the end, it is not the words we leave behind, but the lives we touch. You close your eyes, imagining the countless souls who will one day read his teachings, who will find in them guidance, comfort, and the courage to seek better ways. The night deepens, and your thoughts slow, folding gently into dreams. Confucius's voice fades to a murmur, a soft hum like the turning of a page. Let the world turn, let the heart turn with it. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, the rhythm of the night weaving a slow, steady song, and as sleep takes you, you carry with you the quiet hope that even the smallest acts, like a missing spoon, a careful bow, or a whispered prayer can ripple through time, shaping a world where kindness is the true ritual. Wind down now. The night wraps around you like a soft blanket, the world outside slowing to a gentle breath. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on a calm stream, weightless and free. Imagine the quiet footsteps of history, not thunderous, but steady, moving through centuries with a patience that teaches us to listen more and rush less. Feel the softness of twilight settling into your mind, the echo of Confucius's words, like a gentle murmur at the edge of sleep. Remember that every small kindness, every quiet reflection, is part of a greater harmony that holds us all. Let your breathing slow, your muscles relax, and your mind open to the calm unfolding around you. Tonight, you rest not just in darkness, but in the light of ancient wisdom softly guiding you to peace. End of script. Sweet dreams. you.